Is the single-use plastic ban in Canada at risk from no longer being a ban? We're going to talk about that on this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I have Anthony Morente from Oceana Canada. He's a plastics campaigner. He is here to talk about the ruling that I discussed on last week's episode around the plastic pollution campaign and the ban, and what is going on with the plastic ban in the future, the appeals process, what actually happened, all that stuff on today's episode. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. This is a podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean. And on today's episode, we're going to be talking about what's going on in the ocean, and particularly stuff that can get into the ocean, or what we're trying to prevent from getting in the ocean. Plastic pollution is a real problem, especially when it comes to single-use plastics. Canada was ahead of the curve and said, hey, we're going to be a leader in this. We're going to be one of the countries that federally bans single-use plastics, specific single-use plastics that are getting into the environment, not only on land, in the freshwater, but also in the ocean. And we want to make sure that we take that ban and we put it together and it's robust and it can't be taken down. Unfortunately, it's still new, and big plastic and oil and gas companies are trying to take it down. And unfortunately, as I mentioned last week's episode, they were able to take it down a little bit. And we're going to see what this appeals process is going on. They basically said that the base of the entire ban, that all plastics should not be considered toxic under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. And so what the ruling says is that, yes, you're right, all plastics should not be considered toxic. And so that was the ruling. Now this puts the ban in jeopardy of being sort of dissolved or not really working anymore. So I wanted to make sure that I spoke to somebody who had more information, why this happened, what were the intricacies of the trial, what was brought up, why is it considered not toxic, and then, where do we go from here? What happens in the appeals process? What is the role of different nonprofit organizations in this battle, and what role do they play with the government? And so we got somebody on the podcast, Anthony Morente, who is the plastics campaigner for Oceana Canada, on the podcast to be able to discuss this. And I have to admit, for a large organization, they acted really, really quickly. I was able to contact somebody via email. They said, hey, here's our plastics campaign manager. Anthony would be happy to talk to you. And they had an interview within a couple of days. And I really appreciate Anthony for doing this. The information that he provided us in this interview is just unbelievable. It really goes into showing that it's, bans like this are not black and white. There are a lot of nuances, and he goes through those and we talk about them. We even rant about, grocery stores and plastics and, why are certain foods in plastics when they shouldn't be. We talk a lot about that, and I'm super excited to have him on the show. So without further ado, here is that interview with Anthony Morente talking about the single-use plastic ban in Canada and why it's at risk of dissolving, and what happened in that court ruling, and what we need to do in the future. Enjoy, and I will talk to you after. Hey, Anthony, welcome to the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Are you ready to talk about plastics and ocean conservation?
I am. Thanks for having me.
Right on. I'm very, very excited. This is not the first time I've had somebody on from Oceana Canada. I'm very happy to have, it's been a while, but I'm very happy to have you on the podcast. We're here to talk about a particular story that I covered last week on the podcast about this plastic ban that could be in jeopardy in Canada, single-use plastic ban, where there was a very important court ruling that happened that essentially deemed the plastics that are being banned non-toxic and couldn't be put under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. That kind of raised a lot of questions in my book, and I think a lot of people's book, but it also flew under the radar, I felt, of Canadians. And so what I wanted to do is kind of cover what happened and the significance of that compared in respect to the ban, and then what are the next steps, and what can we do as an audience, as people who want to go for conservation from all over the world? How do we continue to pressure governments and make sure governments are following the right path in banning single-use plastic? So we're going to get into all that, but before we do, Anthony, can you just let us know who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so I'm the plastics campaigner based out of Toronto, Ontario. Not quite next to an ocean, but a Great Lake. I work at
Absolutely.
Oceana Canada. I've been there for about 2 years. My background is actually a marine and freshwater biologist turned policy specialist in the past few years.
Nice. Now you said marines and freshwater biologist. That sounds like you have a marine special freshwater degree from Guelph.
That is very correct. And then a
Ah,
master's
same
from
university.
yeah, and then a master's from the Université de Québec à Montréal in freshwater bio
Very
and
nice.
biochemistry.
Very nice. That's awesome. Right. I went to Guelph as well. I probably graduated a lot earlier than you did, but it was a wonderful program, wonderful university, and they churn out a lot of people in marine freshwater biology and great biologists at that. So happy to have you on the program and happy to be able to talk plastics. Now, how did you get involved, or how did you start working with Oceana Canada? Like, what was the reason why you picked to work with Oceana Canada?
So I come from a background originally of academia. So
Mhm.
through my master's and then post that, I worked in laboratories. I was monitoring a lot of environmental degradation, looking
Mm.
to see how nutrient loading, how ice-free winters, how carbon loading was affecting fresh waters and our coastal ecosystems. And although I loved it, I was starting to get a little frustrated with the fact that a
Mm.
big part of the scientific community is dead set on watching the environment degrade and monitoring and reporting on how bad it's getting, while not actually taking a lot of practical steps in applying that science into making change. Um, I think there is a disconnect between the scientific world in academia and the policy world that actually dictates what is happening to our physical
I
environment. So I made the
completely
jump
agree.
from academia and I moved over into working on data and policy. I moved over to WWF Canada, where I worked
Nice.
on freshwater health assessments, where I worked on trying to protect the Great Lakes from very impractical and flawed environmental policies like the fact that our road salt is not regulated, although it absolutely destroys and devastates fresh water because what's the difference between fresh water and marine water? It's salt. So when you throw a
Yep.
bunch of salt into fresh water, everything dies in it because nothing is adapted to it.
Right.
Um, so I was at WWF for a long time, and there I was working on this provincial, localized Great Lakes kind of file. And I kind of had these like larger ambitions, and I really liked the mission statement that Oceana had.
Yeah.
Oceana works on a federal level. They're trying to make uniform change across the country. They are working to protect oceans, not just to conserve them, to make them healthy and pretty and vibrant, but also to make them healthy so that people can eat from the oceans. It is
Hmm.
really people in nature. It is providing fish to feed the world. And that's the only way I think people really have a true appreciation for nature is when they see themselves in it. Fences don't protect nature. It's you need to have people in nature having an appreciation for it, and I really think that's what Oceana does. So I made the move 2 years ago, and this is where I landed.
It's so true too. The more you're in nature, the more you want to protect it. The more, because the more you fall in love with it. I've known people who hunt. I've known people who fish, and they are huge advocates for protecting oceans and lands. And it's amazing to see. Not only them, but surfers and anybody who has a hobby that spends time in the environment. You just see that protection just kind of grow. And I completely agree with you. Going back to the frustration that you see, just doing science, which is great. It's a lot of fun and it's rewarding. But the fact is, sometimes you just can't stand by. I was a private consultant for a while, environmental consultant. You end up working with industry, and you're just like, you're basically you see this like, I'm helping. I'm protecting the environment to make sure they follow regulations, I'm also helping them eventually destroy the environment, and that's just not something that I could do. So I completely hear you on that. And I'm glad you made the move to Oceana Canada. It's a great organization. And you did you go right into campaigning for on their plastics sort of campaign, on their plastic portfolio?
Yep, I went right into it. One of the things I really like about the way the plastics campaign was structured when I moved into the role is really this science-based decision making. So
Mm.
while I moved from academia, I know how to speak to academics. I know how to read
Yes.
academic papers and take that valuable research and the findings and apply it to policy decisions. So it really is kind of the marrying of the two desires that I have there. It's bringing science into practical policy and making those decisions based on evidence and on fact. So that's I moved over from that, and I try to liaise those two worlds as much as possible.
Gotcha. And you came in at like a very interesting time in Canada, right? This plastic ban was, I believe it. I remember when I'm trying to, was it Minister McKenna back in, it was that was her name, right? Back in like, I think it was like 2018, 2019, maybe. She started to introduce the sort of the idea that there's going to be a single use plastic ban coming up federally, which was really exciting because you started to see other countries like Costa Rica and other countries who were doing the same thing, and all of a sudden Canada, this massive country with this like the longest coastline in the world, being able to ban single use plastics, right? And so that was a huge significance. Then COVID hit and it seemed to delay the process. Elections happened, it seemed to delay the process. But then and correct me if I'm wrong, Anthony, like was it last year, 2022? Was it June 2022 when it went into place?
Well, June 2021 is when they
Okay.
announced the ban was happening and actually
Okay.
threw down the first gauntlet of the bureaucratic process to get it going. But in
Right.
2022 is when it came into effect. Yeah, so it's
Okay.
exactly what you're saying. It's a long process to do
It's a
it. There's a
long
long
process.
runway before it. Nothing is quick in government,
Yeah.
but yeah.
No. Well, and then they have to think of everything because this is, it can be considered controversial depending on what industry you're in. Oil and gas and plastics industry is a big industry. A lot of companies require it in their sort of product line, or they say they require it. It's cheaper and it's all this, and so it makes it a lot easier for people. I feel like this was a big bill to push through, and I have to admit I didn't think I would actually see it happen. I was getting a little worried that it wasn't going to come through, but it came through. Can you just describe sort of what it banned, and then sort of the phased approach that it's taking?
Yeah, so exactly what you're saying with this long runway. And when will it ever happen? Because we did hear about it in 2018 was the first time that it was
Yeah.
ushered that a single-use plastic ban was coming up. 2019, we started to hear some of the items coming through. 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, we actually started having those items solidified. We started hearing six-pack rings, plastic bags, straws, etc. So what you then started seeing publicly was this process of it moving through. Now, when the evolution of those announcements happen, you start to see more refinement of what's happening. And that's
Mm,
really what's happening on the back end of the bureaucratic engine. You are having lobbying meetings with oil and gas, with environmental groups, with community groups to really refine what that list was. And that was a couple of years of stakeholder engagement, right holder engagement,
yeah.
industry engagement to really bring those down to six categories of single use items. So they're not specific products, but categories of them.
Mhm.
You had single use utensils, single use straws, single use bags, you had stir sticks, you had hard to recycle takeout containers, you had anything containing black plastic. You had this really core six that were very common. They were found in
Mhm.
the environment, and one of their big criteria that the government brought up to make them on this list and to kind of put them up for elimination was the fact that there's already an alternative in the Canadian market. This wouldn't be such a shift for people because
Right.
exactly what you're saying. You come out the gate way too controversial, people are going to push back on it.
Yeah.
You need to habituate people into a new process, into a new way of shopping and interacting with their grocery store, their coffee shop, or their restaurant. It's a slow process, but those first six, I think, were a good start.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the six that you see all the time, the six you hear about
Mhm.
quite often. Obviously the plastic movement I felt, anecdotally started with a plastic straw and a sea turtle, and it continued that I like. So here's a quick story, Anthony. I'm very good friends with the person who actually took out that plastic straw from that turtle. And I contacted him before we knew each other. I said, "Hey, I'd want to have you on the podcast." He came on the podcast, Nathan Robinson. Dr. Nathan Robinson. And 4 months later, I remember asking the question, like, what were the odds of a plastic straw being stuck in like a nose of a sea turtle? He was like, I don't know, like 1 in a million, just like never seen it before. So who knows? 4 months later, he pulled out a plastic fork out of an olive ridley sea turtle, and just down the, like, about 70 kilometers down the beach. So it's obviously happening more than we think, and probably more than we really know. But it wasn't just the straw. The straw is the one that made the big headline, and it continues to make the big headline. But the fork, still is significant. And we, plastic utensils are on the plastic ban, as you mentioned. And so all these things, like you said, they're common. The stir sticks are common. Everything is common, and we see it every day. And so it's nice to see that these are going to be phased out in time. And I think even like exporting the plastics to different countries will also be banned. I'm not sure if that's already put in place or it will be put in place at some point.
That's actually one of my favorite parts about the ban. Honestly, it was something we had to, at Oceana Canada, fight really hard for,
Hmm.
in making what that final regulation was. I think a lot of people, when you hear lobbying the government, is always
Yeah.
seen as a bad thing, but
Right.
I lobby the government. Environmental groups lobby the government. Lobbying is just meeting with the government. It can
Hmm.
be done for good or evil, or but somewhere in the middle. But
Yeah. Yeah.
that was something that I and Oceana Canada pushed really hard for. And what is unique about the Canada single-use plastic ban is that we are the first country to ban something domestically while also
Hmm.
banning the export of it. The European bans in Chile, bans in Mexico, they do ban it domestically, but you're still allowed to export it to other
Mm.
countries. And I view that as like offloading our garbage onto someone else and continuing the
Yeah.
problem. And that, I think, argument resonated with the government really well. And I think it's a good way that we should just be approaching pollution in general. It's not that if we deem it bad for us, it should be bad
Yeah.
for our neighbor as well.
A couple of points you pointed out there. I mean, one, just, we saw the backlash that, internationally we had as Canadians when, it was kind of discovered, I guess, or revealed that we were shipping out a lot of our plastic that we couldn't recycle to small island states. I think we received a lot of backlash about that. So it makes sense that we put in the bill that you can't export plastic to be used and disregarded or discarded in any kind of way, where we have no, you don't have any kind of say on how it gets exported, how it gets treated or managed from a waste perspective. And so I really like that. And again, the lobbying of the government, I mean, you work with the government to put in certain things, and based on, like you said, the science that's out there, and what it needs to be done and what needs to be added. And some things you want that are on there that may not get on there, other things that you want is on there, and that's the process, right? And it's sometimes it's a compromise, sometimes it's not. um but you work with the government to get those put on the regulations, and then help them pass it through, and so forth in any way you can, which I love. And I think that's the part of organizations like Oceana Canada where you don't really hear about. You hear about the awareness campaigns, and that's what we get from the public. But in the backgrounds, we know what you guys are doing. We know, what the organizations are doing in terms of like, hey, let's work with policy. Let's inform them. We have a lot of resources that they may not have, our government may not have, and we also hear from our supporters, and this is what they want. This is what they want to hear, and this is what the science says. So I like that aspect of, and I'm glad you mentioned it to be able to be a part of it. So was Oceana Canada part of it from the beginning?
Yes. Yeah. It's in order to kind of have a really good plastics campaign, we needed to kind of get our foot in the door right at the gate. So exactly what you're saying about the science building into it and that kind of informing what's on the list and how we approach it. The whole ban really started from just listing plastics as
Hmm.
toxic in the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, because for years, like we said with that long runway, when they announced they wanted to ban single-use plastic, those are all public commitments that at the time the government was still trying to figure out, but how? what
Mm.
what is the legal mechanism the federal government can use? What is the tool in our toolbox in order to actually make that a reality? And that's why you saw that long runway, because it's not as easy as I think some people think. Parliament can't just stand up and say, we're done with plastic, chop it, and then everyone in the house stands up and claps and they applaud. I think if you've ever watched a clip from the House of Commons, that's not what happened.
No, it's not what happens.
So in that interim, what they had to do was first they needed to figure out how we're going to ban single-use plastic, how we're going to get this off the ground. And that came first with a science assessment, a huge, sweeping, comprehensive piece of work to look at plastic, how it is interacting with the environment. Is it degrading? Oh my God. How it's how it's impacting the environment, if it's degrading. Here we go. That's an easier way to say it. If it's degrading the environment. If it's posing a risk to human and environmental health, and to what degree and what sources, and what environments are being impacted by that. So there was this huge science assessment. It took years to pull together. It pulled together lots of data, not just within Canada, but globally, and tried to take as many Canadian examples as possible. What we found on beaches, what we found in the stomachs of animals, where we found strangulation, where we found plastic bags stuck in trees, where we saw microplastics stuck in the sand. Plastic is everywhere. I don't think that is a hard sell for people to know. I think we've all seen headlines of a whale washed up and its stomach is open, it's filled with plastic. You see sea lions, you see seabirds entangled. It's almost commonplace, and I don't want people to get habituated to it, but it is fact. It's out there, and it is documented, which is really well. So this huge science assessment had to be undertaken, and then from that assessment, the government has to read into it and say, all right, we know that the science says plastic is bad. It is bad for the environment, it's bad for our health, it's bad for wildlife. Now, in order to make a regulation to control that under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, you need to look to this thing called Schedule 1, which is a list of things that are known toxics to the environment, like a toxicant. It's a toxic substance. And on that list already are things like carbon dioxide, mercury, lead, arsenic, microbeads in beauty products. They range from very specific things to very broad things. Like carbon dioxide, I mean, you breathe. That's carbon dioxide. But when it's carbon dioxide, it's emissions from factories. But when it's like something like lead or arsenic, that's very specific. That's how you get lead out of gas. That's unleaded gas that came from listing it there. So they had to then put plastics on Schedule 1. And when they looked at the science assessment, they said, listen, lots of plastic is the source of plastic pollution. And what is more worrisome about listing something on Schedule 1 is that the plastics industry grows very quickly. There are thousands of different combinations of different polymers and resins and chemicals and additives that make new plastics. These are all words that are like extremely biochemical and are like meant for a laboratory, and it's hard for like the average person to understand it. But I think it's necessary for people to understand that the plastics industry is not stagnant. There's not five types of plastic. There are thousands of combinations, and normally they're put together. They're like hybrids of each other in a lot of instances. So when the government put plastics on Schedule 1, they didn't just put plastic bags. They didn't just put like plastic forks or straws. They put plastic manufactured items. Because that industry is so large, so broad, so ever growing, ever changing, and pollution from it is coming from a plethora of sources. So they took that broad approach. And that's what the science told them to do. That's what Parliament kind of agreed on. They passed that bill. They said, yes, we are adding plastic manufactured items to Schedule 1. Now that plastic was added to Schedule 1, you could start making regulations. So that's where the ban grows from that. You can kind of think of Schedule 1 as like a flower pot, and the first flower coming out of it is your ban.
Gotcha.
And this whole court case ruling is not challenging the ban. It's challenging the listing. It's the foundation of future and current environmental regulations to try to limit plastic pollution. It's really
Hmm.
attacking the pot, which is
Yeah.
more important than I think a lot of people understand. It's their ability to tackle plastic pollution at a federal national scale, because I don't know, if you throw plastic pollution into the air, it doesn't just stay in Ontario. It doesn't just stay in Toronto.
No,
It
exactly.
it goes to the next province over. It flows downriver. It leads
Hmm.
to different things. So when you pollute in the Great Lakes, that's now Quebec's problem. It's then Nova
Yeah.
Scotia's problem. It's then
Yeah.
Prince Edward Island's problem. It's the USA's problem.
Yep.
It doesn't know boundaries. So they
Right.
took that broad approach, and that's really where the trouble started.
Yeah, and let's dive into that, because that's that was my concern. It was okay. So the way they got the ban in place was to put plastics on Schedule 1. I like the tactic. I like the strategy around that. It makes sense. From a scientific perspective. And the way they went about it. So coming up with the ban because it's considered toxic, that makes sense. Attacking the Schedule 1 listing, it makes sense as well, I guess, from Big Plastic. What did the I guess plaintiff or Big Plastic say why it shouldn't be considered toxic?
Yeah. So to kind of give a little bit of context on that, it's interesting because plastic manufactured items was listed on Schedule 1. And then you immediately saw this opposition and response from Big Plastic.
Right.
All the large plastic companies, and let's not forget that plastic is a oil and gas byproduct. So when I
Yes.
say big plastic, it's almost synonymous with oil and gas companies or
Hmm.
subsidiaries of large oil and gas companies. They came together and they created this association um, called the Responsible Plastic Users Coalition.
Isn't that
Uh,
an interesting name?
it's a very interesting name. And it was named such because, in the eyes of Big Plastic, not all plastic is plastic pollution. Not all plastic
Mm.
is bad. And here's what I will very much give kudos to the oil and gas industry, to Big Plastic. No matter who you talk to on the industry side of it, they have extremely well made key talking points, and that is uniform across their industry. You will hear the same talking points: that plastic helps your food last longer, that plastic makes cars lighter, therefore they require less gas, that plastic makes planes lighter, therefore they require less jet fuel, that plastic is essential for EVs, for defibrillators, for hospital equipment, for windmills, for solar panels, for your computers. Plastic
Right.
is everywhere. And those are extremely good talking points. And they're not
Hmm.
wrong. Plastic is
Right.
everywhere, and there are a lot of essential uses to it. But the government has never signaled that they are going to start banning plastic in defibrillators. They've never signaled that
Right.
they're going to ban uh, masks that people use, or PPE that people use to stay healthy or to keep hospitals going. Latex gloves are plastic, but
Yeah.
you've never seen a signal from the government that they're going to do this. But this coalition of responsible plastic users, and then their larger companies like Dow, Imperial Oil, Nova
Hmm.
Chemicals, they said no, the risk is far too great. The government, with this listing of all plastics are toxic under Schedule 1, means that they could, in theory, regulate all plastic. They
Yeah.
haven't. They've never signaled that they're going
No.
to. If anything, the government has really kept it quite narrow with what they've ever signaled that they're going to limit. And those are essentially single use plastic items, plastic
Hmm.
packaging, and basically
Hmm.
what at Oceana we call and we campaign for is the removal of non-essential single-use plastic. I
Yeah.
don't think anyone's arguing that an electric
No.
vehicle is good. I don't think anyone's
Yeah,
arguing
for
that
sure.
a bike is good
Yeah.
or your phone is necessary or
Yeah.
PPE is good. So that was their concern. They said, no, we can't just trust the government won't regulate this. We want to quash their ability
Yeah.
to even do that. So
So
that
what they're worried about is going back to your analogy of the pot and the flowers, the ban of like the non-essential single-use plastics. They're thinking that another flower will pop up that might go even further to maybe essential, or what they're worried about is all plastics or different types of plastics, and that continuing to blossom, so to speak.
Correct. They think that the next flowers that come out of that pot will basically turn the lights off for their company.
Right.
That will lay off thousands of people. That will halt the Canadian economy. That will destroy trade agreements that Canada has with the US, China, Europe, etc., on how we buy, sell, move our plastic items. They thought this was too big of a risk to
Right.
kind of just leave out there. So that's when they filed their legal challenge against the listing of toxic substance.
I mean, it makes sense, I guess, from a company standpoint, but unfortunately, the cost is potentially this ban on the non-essential single-use plastic. So from this point, the ruling went in saying plastic should not be considered toxic. Is that correct?
They said that not all plastics should be considered toxic. And I
Gotcha.
really want to kind of highlight that because I was in the
Yeah.
courtroom in
Oh,
March.
okay.
Yeah, it was at the federal court in Toronto down at Queen and University. I sat through 3 days of listening to the arguments on both sides in the courtroom. And admittedly, the plastics companies openly said, yes, some plastics do make their way into the environment, and those plastics do have devastating effects. We've all seen the news reports and the scientific reports that whales are washing up, that seabirds are dying, that fish are
Hmm.
polluted. They're acknowledging that there is plastic in the environment, but what they are arguing is that not a lot is getting into the environment and not all of it is getting into the environment.
Mm.
But on the contrary, what I thought was interesting was that the examples they're bringing up are rail cars are made of plastic, cars are made of plastic. They don't end up in rivers and lakes. And I was like, well,
Yeah. Some
actually,
do.
no, they do.
Yeah.
I hate to break it to some of these lawyers, but having worked in lakes and rivers and coastal
Yeah.
communities, I can tell you that at night, a lot of people will go throw their garbage out into the lake because why? It's expensive to go to a landfill. It has no extra
Yeah.
use. Some areas do not have right to repair. Our waste is not managed well. And
Right.
one of their big arguments was on the management side. Well, that's not the federal government's job. That's the province's job. Waste
Mm.
is a provincial jurisdiction. So not only did they bring up the argument that not all plastics have the likelihood that they will become pollution, but regardless, even if some get into the environment, that's not the federal government's job. That's something you need to
That's the
fix with the
provincial.
provinces. So
Yeah.
you have this kind of double header here. One, that's unconstitutional to have this super broad approach, and two, that's not your jurisdiction. Those were the two
Right.
arguments that they brought up.
So with this ruling,
Mhm.
um, where do we go from here if we want to see this plastic ban stay in place? Like, so with this ruling, does the ban stay in place or does it just dissolve?
Yeah, so this is where the nuance of, I think, a longer conversation like this really comes into play and is helpful. The judge said plastic pollution is everywhere. We know that. This
Hmm.
idea that the government shouldn't try to tackle plastic pollution, that's not an argument that we should entertain. But the judge did agree this broad approach was too large, that the
Mm.
evidence was not super clear that all plastics can become pollution, that the government needs to come in narrow. And there are cases in the past in Canada that set a precedent that you can't just trust someone to act narrowly while they have the ability to act broadly. So this is what the judge said. That was the ruling. The ruling was not bring back single use plastic, it's great,
Right.
or no, I don't believe that there's no plastic pollution in the environment. The judge was quite articulate on that and very responsive to the arguments that plastic pollution exists and that is harmful to
Right.
the environment. It's just the approach was too broad. So the ruling then says this broad approach can't be taken. Now, that does essentially quash any sort of regulation after it. It's like, if we're going back to the flower pot, it's like, ooh, that flower was just about to blossom, and I put a cap.
Yeah.
I put a cap on top of the
Right.
pot, and I said no.
Okay.
So the federal government has signaled that they're going to seek an appeal on that order. They think that the judge is overlooking some of the arguments is not kind of reading into the interpretation of the law that the government can actually act on a very precautionary approach. That was something that even when I read through it, now I'm going to say I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a legal expert, but reading through the decision, there was this kind of overlook of the fact that the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, it does allow the government to act in a precautionary way. You don't need to
Mm-hmm.
100% know where something is coming from, but if
Mm-hmm.
you have evidence that there's pollution and that it's harmful to the
Right.
environment, that you should be able to act on it.
Right.
And that's something that's written in the act. So that argument, I think, is going to maybe be a root of the appeal. The second thing is the other side of the argument, industry argued that you need to measure toxic um, effects or how toxic a substance is in a very specific way. That you need to
Hmm.
expose animals in the environment to levels of plastic and see how they respond,
Hmm.
which
Interesting.
I mean, like I came from academia. I understand the idea that if you want to see how much, I mean, this is a really harsh example, but if you want to see how much arsenic kills a fish, it's adding drops of arsenic into a tank to see what the concentration is that proves lethal.
Yeah.
Okay, that's one way of measuring how arsenic is toxic, but
Yeah.
plastic is not that. So I want to kind of pull back to your example of the straw or the fork in a turtle. Now, that's a very like charismatic example, but it
Yeah.
takes one fork or one straw to interact with an animal in an unceremonious way that will
Yeah.
kill it. It's not like
Yeah.
you have to expose a turtle or a bird or a whale to 1, 3, 8, 9 forks, bags. It's one. One in the wrong situation can kill it.
Yeah.
1,000 in the wrong situation can kill it.
Yeah.
So that
Yeah.
idea of you have to measure toxicity in one specific way, I think is flawed. And I think that will also be a part of the appeal process. But going back to the root of your question, the government will appeal that decision. And when they apply for an appeal, they will also put a stay on the order. That means that as they appeal, the listing of plastic as toxic will stay on Schedule 1, which means the ban
Gotcha.
is still in effect because that foundation is still there. We're taking the lid off right now. We're saying, whoa, 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 wait until we've
Yeah.
heard everything.
Yeah.
And if we look at the Canadian legal system, you have the federal court, which is where they heard the first argument that went in favor of industry. Then there's the Federal Court of Appeal, which is what
Yeah.
we're about to wade into in December. And then, even if that does not go the way, there is another level of court above that. There's the Supreme Court of Canada.
Mm-hmm.
So we do have other levels coming to it, but I will say the ban is in effect. It
Yeah.
is still there because of this appeal process. However, while they are seeking an appeal, no new regulations will likely come out of the government. And
Right.
I think that is the biggest setback because
Yeah.
industry's opposition to this has stalled what we can do to fight plastic pollution. And every year, Canadians generate like 4.3 million tons of plastic waste a year. And
It's insane.
now we have to wait another year of just
Yeah.
making the same waste without reducing it, without introducing solutions. And I think that is also the biggest disappointment from the industry is that, okay, if you're the Responsible Plastic User Coalition, you're opposing regulation, you're opposing solutions, but you're
Yeah.
also not providing any solution.
No, that's the thing, right?
If you're going to say not all plastic, and we acknowledge that there is plastic pollution
Mm-hmm.
coming from here, then stop making that plastic. Then start making products better. Start making things that align with recycling systems, align with municipal waste collection, align with the ways that provinces can handle it, if that's what you truly believe. But we're not
Yeah.
seeing that from them. So we're seeing companies like Dow Chemical, Imperial Oil, Nova Chemical expand operations, which is super contradictory to what they said in
It's like
court.
doubling down basically
Yeah,
on
and
plastic.
the only people that lose are Canadians who overwhelmingly don't want single-use plastic. It's like 90% of Canadians in our polling want federal action on plastic pollution, specifically on single-use plastic. And it's just
Yeah.
it's a nonpartisan issue, and it's becoming a partisan issue. It's becoming an industry kind of tactic to
Yeah.
expand plastic production while offering no solutions. And I don't think that Canadians should kind of stand for it.
Agreed. Totally agree. Now, so with that said, we know, well, I guess before we get into that question of what can we do as citizens and non-citizens who are listening to this, what's Oceana's plan going forward? Are you working, toward of like the quote unquote lobbying or helping the government put a plan together from an Oceana Canada perspective, or what's the role for Oceana Canada from here on out with this appeal process?
Yeah, so in the listing of plastic as toxic in the development of the ban, uh, we were pushing hard for strong regulation for things that had
Yeah.
no technical loopholes, to list products that are known large sources of plastic pollution that we can easily phase out. That if we look at the global landscape of policies to reduce plastic that work, and there's precedent, so let's bring that here. Let's take the best of what France has to offer, the best Australia has to offer, the best Chile has to offer. Let's have that in Canada. I don't see
Mm,
why we have to be lagging when we could be a global
right.
leader on it, both from a
100%.
government and an industry perspective. It's remarkable to me that these international organizations or international companies, like beverage companies and e-commerce delivery companies, have really good anti-single-use regulations or policies in other countries, but they don't implement it internationally throughout all their operations. So I'm like,
Yeah.
bring that here. Um, but in the development of those regulations and pushing for them, we also intervened legally on the court case to support the federal government in that first challenge. Now,
Okay.
when the federal government officially files for appeal, environmental groups like Oceana Canada and our other interveners in the original case, like Environmental Defense or Animal Justice,
Hmm.
will likely also evaluate if we should continue intervening on that, because this is an approach that we support. We support large national sweeping regulation because if there's a top-down pressure to do
Hmm.
the response is just so much greater. the there's a difference between a company having a corporate commitment versus a city having a bylaw versus a province having a regulation where maybe it's not the largest province in Canada, but it still has impact. National sweeping regulation is the biggest change.
Yeah.
It's the best way to go about it.
Right.
Now, like I said, if this appeal goes through, that means that there's a pause on new regulations. So, what do environmental groups and Canadians do? We pivot. This is number one, these companies that sought opposition, eh, you need to call them out. You need to say, bring a
Yeah.
solution to the table. Um,
Yeah.
these are things that people are now considering. We need to try to change things on the individual level, which I'm not a huge fan of pushing that narrative. I don't think it's everyone's fault that
No, exactly.
you're forced to buy all this single use plastic. It is so much more effective to get the system to change. But
Right.
in that way, too, there's also ways that you, as an individual, can kind of affect that change. I know for me, like one of the biggest sources of single use plastic that we found through one of our recent reports called Breaking the Plastic Cycle, we identified the largest sources of single use plastic in Canada, and there are clear sectors. One of them is like dine in single use plastic. Like, think if you're going to a coffee shop or a restaurant and you're sitting down to have a coffee, have like a
Hmm.
muffin or a sandwich on your lunch or in the morning, but you're given like a to go cup and you're given like a plastic
Yeah.
plate or given a biodegradable fork, which, by the way, to anyone listening, it's plastic, it's not biodegradable, it's on the ban list. Get rid of it.
Yeah.
Anything
Get
that
rid
says
of it.
biodegradable, compostable plastic, I mean, ask any municipal composter, they'll say that does not go here. That goes right to
Yeah.
landfill. Um,
Yeah.
but one of the biggest things you can do, yes, you yourself can bring a reusable mug. You can be sure to tell the barista or someone behind the counter, no, it's for here. Please put this in like an
Yeah.
actual cup. Or you could use social media. You could ask to, like, I mean, this is a very Karen thing, speak to the manager, but you could tell them, I really am kind of upset with the whole way that single-use plastic is going in Canada. And one of the biggest ways that we can like make an impact is if your restaurant, your cafe stop giving people single-use plastic when they're sitting here to go, when you have a dishwasher, when you
Yeah.
have glasses or mugs.
Yeah.
You could try to affect change at a greater scale than that. That it's still hyper local, it's within your control,
Yep.
but it's more of an impact because now that's like thousands of other people coming after you that they don't have to bring a mug. It's the mug is
Exactly.
provided to them.
Yeah.
There are steps people can do that, but there's also the nice thing about Canadian geography is that, I mean, massive country, but very isolated, larger cities where most of our plastic waste is coming from. I
Yeah.
would encourage people to start getting engaged in local politics, start pushing for bylaws that ban single-use plastic at sports venues. I don't
Mm-hmm.
know how many times it's so frustrating to see a beer or a cider or like a Coke poured from a can
From a
into a
can.
single-use cup, and I'm like,
It
just
drives me
give me the
nuts.
can. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a whole
I've
thing.
had that happen. They wouldn't give me the can. They said we can't. It's policy. And you're like, you've got to be kidding me. And I told them that too. I said the same thing. I was like, this is not environmentally friendly at all.
But see, this is why top-down regulation is so important because
Right.
you have a venue say it's a policy, you could have a restaurant say it's a policy, but if you
Yeah.
have a city or a province saying
Yeah.
that nope, that policy is throw that out the window. The bylaw is this. Um, Starting to become a local advocate and speaking to your city councilor, your local rep, your MP, your MPP, really pushing for strong regulation. I think the
Mm-hmm.
overwhelming majority of Canadians, when we're polling people on single use plastic, is that they want action. And if currently, when an appeal goes through, if we're on pause for action at the federal level, that means we need to turn to our cities, we need to turn to our provinces, we need to turn to our communities, our local establishments that we interact with that are huge sources of single use plastic. And we need to push them to do better. And
Yeah.
it's unfortunate we can't work at this national scale at the moment because of industry opposition, but it's not like Canadians are just going to stop. And I think
Exactly.
one of the biggest opportunities, and I think light that's going to be shone on um, industry specifically, is when in the spring of next year, the global plastics treaty negotiations, that is over
Yes.
160 countries coming together to talk about how to globally, that's the biggest top down you possibly could
Mm-hmm.
have, regulate plastic pollution and plastic production and really try to phase out these things that do not get recycled, these things that end up in the environment, things that impact human health from the very beginning of their life cycle, from
Yeah.
petrochemical plants that are in Cancer Alley in the US, that are at the
Mm-hmm.
front lines of First Nations communities in Southern Ontario and Northern Alberta, where people are exposed to carcinogens and poisonous air and land and water and soil across this
Yeah.
entire life cycle of plastics. It's a really good opportunity to highlight the impacts of plastic pollution. And they're going to be in Canada. And
Yep.
I think that is so important that if you're going to be an industry that is opposing the ability to regulate and fight plastic pollution, that you should be front and center to say, well,
Yep.
then what are we doing?
Yep.
Because if you're just going to stall the process when 160 countries are coming together in Ottawa to talk about how to come up with solutions, and domestically, your operations can't provide one solution, it's going to look bad on you, and it's a global
Yeah.
spotlight on you. It's no longer just, oh, I missed the Canadian news cycle, and we got
Right.
we got through
Right.
this one. It's,
It's gonna be
oh,
international.
it's international, and it's
Yeah.
word spreads quite easily. And I think when you see these massive global boycotts of industries,
Mm-hmm.
they take hits quite large. And it's interesting that a lot of these plastic producing companies that don't have well-known brands associated with them, like I would be hard pressed to find someone on the street and say, hey, what does Nova Chemical make? Or what
Yeah.
does Dow make? Imperial Oil, most people kind of know what that is. They go, oh yeah,
Yeah.
that's my
Yeah.
gas. But if you were to ask them, they don't have like a product or a brand.
No.
But when there's a global stage on you, let me tell you, people make TikToks, people
Oh
show
yes.
show
We
what you
know the
make.
power.
Yeah,
Yeah.
things change quite quickly. So I think it's an interesting time.
Well, that's the one thing that I was so proud of for Canada before this ruling happened was, we are having the treaty, the plastic treaty come in. in Ottawa next spring, and we were kind of ahead of the curve a little bit, and here we have this setback. Are you optimistic about the what could come out of this in terms of like we could beat this thing?
Well, it's funny you're saying we were ahead of the curve. I think we were like leading the curve for like a hot minute. It was so nice to see. Um, we had a national plastics registry in the pipeline.
Yeah.
We had recycled content standards in the pipeline. We had truth and transparency and recyclability
Oh,
labeling on plastic
that
products,
is
which
just
is
so necessary.
huge because I'm just going to say this terrible fact once. We only recycle 8% of plastic waste in Canada. 8%. So that is, I think, such a disheartening statistic because if
Hmm.
you ask anyone, they feel good about their sustainability choices, that they're, yes, buying things in plastic, but they're
Yeah.
putting it in the blue bin. And it is, it's such a downer to say, it's okay, but no.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
only that hard plastic is getting recycled. Everything that's flexible
Exactly.
is getting burned, it's getting sent to a landfill. Everything that says biodegradable or compostable, they're not necessarily getting to those facilities, and they're not backyard compostable, which I think a lot of
No,
people think that's
I
what
think
it is,
that's what it is. Yeah.
but it's
Yeah.
not. So it's one of those things that we were going to have so many good things coming through. And one of my
Hmm.
favorite was the fact that we're going to have this pollution prevention plan with grocery stores, which is not what it was made out to be in the media. A pollution prevention plan was a hand in hand government and industry collectively coming together to find a solution to have an overall waste reduction target. And nothing in that pollution prevention plan that they put out as the draft was novel. France unwraps almost
Right.
all their groceries. Chile and Mexico and Brazil and the UK and Germany sell a lot of their products in refillable, reusable, and returnable bottles from a grocery store, from a beer store, from an aisle.
Yeah.
It's not crazy to put these things
Right.
out.
It's
And
been done. They're doing it right now. We just need to
it's
put it in place.
it's been done, and it's what we used to have. It's not like
Yeah.
anyone's reinventing the wheel here. It's like it's actually dialing it back about 50 years. And if
Yeah.
you ask anyone's parents or
Yeah.
where, like, depending on what age you are, you probably remember this. Like,
Hmm. Hmm.
I'm in my mid 30s and I remember Coca-Cola and Pepsi and ginger ale being in a glass bottle. And if you
Yeah.
look at an ad for a
Yeah.
lot of those beverage companies, they only show the glass bottle in the ads. But like, where do you buy a
It
glass
looks nicer.
bottle? Look,
Yeah.
I mean, it
Can't
looks
get
nice
it anymore.
because it is nicer.
Yeah, it is. It's
but
nicer.
but you don't see it that often, and
No.
a lot of the asks the government were doing. They were very reasonable, and all these narratives that like plastic is gonna, or if we remove plastic, your food's gonna be more expensive. No, it won't.
Yeah.
If we
No.
remove plastic, your food's gonna spoil. No, it won't. It won't, because guess where your food spoils? In your fridge, because you're forced to buy 8 peppers. You're forced to buy 30 Brussels
Yes.
sprouts, and you don't
Yes.
manage the amount you have.
No.
So you're forced to buy a certain amount at a certain price. You don't have
Yeah.
autonomy over your wallet. You don't have autonomy over your selection, whatever. Sorry, that's my rant about this grocery store thing.
No,
It's very frustrating.
I'm nodding. If people can't see it over the audio podcast, I'm nodding and smiling. It's like, why do I need 8 peppers? I don't eat 8 peppers. I usually have one or two in a meal, and that's all I need.
No, and these
And it just
regulations,
goes to waste other than that.
yeah, and these regulations that were in the pipeline were so collectively, one country having all of these in place, we would have been like global
Yeah.
leaders, 100%.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna say one last thing about grocery stores because this
Yeah.
really annoys me. You will read a lot of opinion pieces that are mostly based on American data. Number one, not Canadian data. But please, someone explain to me the math that 3 peppers plus a plastic bag is more expensive than 3 peppers, no bag. Why is that bag -$? It doesn't make
Yeah.
sense to me. It
Yeah.
the math is not there, and I think this is one of the other things that is like a very real part of this conversation about opposition to regulation. A lot of the data that we're having, it's coming from the US and coming from US distributors. It's not necessarily Canadian data.
Hmm.
And I will say, when you look at who applied to fight the Canadian government in court, They were Canadian companies. You have Dow Chemical, Nova Chemical, Imperial Oil. I'll say their name again and again because
Yeah.
you need to know
These are
who
the
are the
ones.
companies that oppose this without providing a solution. But also the American Petrochemical Association and the American Chemistry Council. There's clearly a vested interest in trade
Yeah.
agreements with the US, with
Hmm.
American plastic companies, because, and this is not private knowledge, it's very public, the United States is the largest plastic producing country in the world.
Hmm.
We border
Makes
them.
sense.
They have a vested interest in us continuing making plastic.
Yeah.
The problem here is that we have no solutions. Refill and reuse is right there. We do it for beer. We do it for wine. Why don't you
Yeah.
do it for pop and water and
Yeah.
juice? Do
Not a
that.
difficult thing. Yeah.
Do that. Why
Yeah.
why can we not unwrap our fruits and vegetables? Why can it not
Hmm.
be a regulation, or have a corporate commitment that if you are a large fast food chain, if you are a large coffee shop and you have a dishwasher,
Yeah.
train staff to say for here or to go, and if it's for here,
Yes.
no single use plastic. Could be
Yeah. My
reusable.
my big beef, my big beef with groceries, sorry to interrupt, is bananas in a plastic bag.
Wild.
Uh, why? There's already a cover on the banana itself. Like it's built in. It's like
It,
there's
if
it's
something
got a peel,
if
you
something
know?
has a rind or a peel or a shell, you don't need to wrap it. Now there are
No.
exceptions, and I will admit this, and I think that this is where you need to be reasonable. Think something like berries.
Yeah, of
Yeah,
course.
berries
Yeah.
they go bad very quickly. Yeah, you can put
Yeah.
them in plastic. If you're going to pre-cut and pre-wash produce like spinach, sure. But you already see the
Yeah.
option where you don't, like, there's loose bundles of spinach and I put it right in my
Yeah.
crisper and I don't have a bag in any of the process and it lasts just as long.
Just as long.
But like, okay, I can buy an individual potato, but do I need to buy 50 potatoes at once in a plastic bag? No. Do I need to
No.
buy 12 apples at once? I love
Right.
apples. I never get through all the apples. I
No.
never get, and once I bring them home, guess what? I take them out of the bag and you put them in. I mean, like, I try as much as I can to buy just three,
Yeah.
four individual loose ones. I've trained my partner to stop using produce bags because you just don't need it. I'm like, where are you moving
No.
it? You're putting the bag
Yeah.
in the fridge. You're not. You're taking it off. So,
Yeah.
I mean, like, again, this is the thing of that's an individual action, but it shouldn't be that way. It should just be the default
Exactly.
is the unwrap. But sorry, this
Yep.
was my. I
Yep.
keep going on this grocery store
Nope.
rant, but here I am.
I get it. Anthony, I completely get it. It's you're not the only one who feels that way. Obviously, there are many of us who feel that way, including the members of this audience who feel the same way. And it's frustrating, when we see the same thing happen over and over again. But you're right. A top-down sort of approach is probably the best approach, the most effective approach. We're seeing it here in Canada. The government in Canada wants to do it. We're just getting some setbacks from here. I'm glad you were able to talk us through the entire process from starting this, creating the ban and what led to creating the ban, and now this ruling, and talking about, the nuances around everything that could happen, and what's going to happen in the future, and the appeal and everything. And you said the appeal process will start in December.
Well, the government of Canada only has, I believe it's about 30 days. Again, I'm not a legal
Okay.
expert, but I do believe it
Right.
is 30 days from the decision, which would put you
Okay.
somewhere around mid-December. They
Okay.
should be public. So if we're looking at a timeline, first the government has to make that decision
Yeah.
to appeal it. They are the defendant in it. They were challenged. And then
Yeah.
from there, you will likely see environmental groups like Oceana Canada take their stance about what is
Gotcha.
the next step and what is more strategic, because we know the Canadians want this fight to continue, but we also have
Okay.
to be very strategic in what is the most effective.
Yep.
Do we add value to being an intervener on that case? I think yes, probably.
Yeah.
We do.
Absolutely.
Um,
Absolutely.
but are there other avenues that we could start tackling as well, knowing that throughout the whole appeal process, no new regulations can likely go out the door? We need to then start engaging other avenues to fight plastic pollution. And that's what we've seen Canadians call for. We don't want people to become comfortable. We don't want people to rest on this. We want to keep adding pressure and fight plastic pollution, because one of the really critical things to remember about this is, like, the planet is finite. The
Mm-hmm.
oceans are only so deep. Lakes are only
Yeah.
so long, or, sorry, rivers are only so long, lakes are only so deep, oceans are only so wide. Forests are there. They're not growing. We're not getting infinite land. So when plastic pollution gets into it and those plastic products last for hundreds of years,
Yeah.
they build up. Even if only a little bit is leaking into the environment, which we know a
Perfect.
lot is leaking into the environment, it builds up year after year. It's
Yeah.
still there. The plastic cup from 10 years ago, it's still there. The bottle cap from 100 years ago, it's still there. And we're seeing more and more like garbage building up on beaches, washing ashore, rivers being flooded, animals washing up with stomachs full of plastic. And we're seeing it more and more because that concentration in the environment is growing and growing and growing.
Hmm.
So we need to stop pouring plastic into the environment as soon as possible.
Completely agree, Anthony. This has been really, eye opening. I think for a lot of us to see what goes into this, and of course, definitely we need to take action. If people want to follow this along with Oceana Canada and what Oceana Canada is doing, where can they go to do so?
Oh, thank you. My comms team would kill me if I didn't plug this. We have, you can go onto our website, oceana.ca. That is ocean with an A,
Yep.
OCEANA.ca. You can follow us on Instagram, X, formerly Twitter, Facebook, every kind of social media platform. Our TikTok is growing at Oceana Canada. And there's also the larger Oceana too, as well. That is based out of the
Yeah.
US. But the thing we love about Oceana is we're taking a global approach to this. We have plastic
Yeah.
campaigns in Canada, the United States, Mexico, Brazil, Chile, the EU, UK, the Philippines. We are all over the world trying to fight this as a coordinated effort. So I'm really proud to be a part of the Canadian part of that. We have a great team behind us, and I would say, yeah, explore our website to learn more.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Anthony. Really appreciate it. We'll have you back on maybe when we see some more news come out of maybe another ruling that's more in our favor, hopefully. But we'd love to have you back on to talk more about plastics and the plastic ban, and hopefully making sure that it's not only reinstated, but it could continue to go on further and further and further. But we really appreciate your time, and thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much, Anthony, for coming on the podcast here on the How to Protect the Ocean podcast and talking about what happened in that court ruling, what we need to do in the future, and rant about grocery stores and plastics, and just the little things that we can do, but really, emphasizing that a top-down approach for plastic ban is really important here. Right. We need to ensure that these single-use plastics are not available in the environment. And unfortunately, what I took out of that was it's really unfortunate that the plastic industry and the oil and gas industry are willing to sacrifice doing something good for the environment because they're for single-use plastics that are common, the ones that are on the ban right now, because they're worried about a risk of other plastics being banned. It just goes to show they don't care about the environment. It goes to show all they care about is their profit. All they care about is their business's future. They don't care about the harm that it could provide, even if it's just in a small amount that may not affect them in the future. So that's concerning to me from a business perspective, as someone who tries to support businesses to make better decisions around the environment. We had businesses here, like, we had an insurance company, an insurance broker, with Bernie Geis coming on and saying, hey, you know what, I want to do something good for the environment. I still want to have my business, but I want my business to be part of that because these are my values. And we're not seeing these values in large corporations. We're not seeing these values in big plastic and in oil and gas. We see that time and time again. They're actually campaigning against doing any kind of action around climate change or around banning plastic, single-use plastics, and it's just really disappointing to see. So I was really happy to have Anthony Morente to kind of highlight that. Also, provide us with some information of what we can do and how we can follow these campaigns. So feel free to go into the show notes and look up oceanacanada.ca, as well as their Instagram, TikTok, X or Twitter, all their social media accounts, and on LinkedIn as well. I'll put those links in the show notes. So if you don't know what the show notes are, if you're new to podcasting, no worries, I got you back. All you have to do is go in the app. Say you're an Apple Podcast, you go into the app, you look down, there's a bit of a description. We call those the show notes. The bit of a description, there's some links in there. You click on those, it brings you right to the website, the TikTok, the Instagram, the X, Twitter, whatever platform you want to take a look at what they're doing. Highly recommend you follow them. Highly recommend that you interact with them. and provide your support if you want to. So thank you again, Anthony. Thank you, Oceana Canada. And thank you, the listener, for listening to the podcast. Really appreciate it. If you have any questions or comments on this podcast, this episode, or any other episode in the podcast, please feel free to DM me on Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean. I would love to chat with you. You can also go to speakupforblue.com, check out the How to Protect the Ocean podcast, the Beyond Jaws podcast, Fancy Scientists, as well as Aqueducts. There are a lot of podcasts on there, a lot of episodes, so lots for you to listen to. And let us know what you think through a review on any of those podcasts, on any of the platforms. We'd be happy to hear from you and get your feedback, as well as it offers people an idea when they go and search for the podcast and they look at the reviews, say, what am I going to get out of this podcast? I want that review to tell me. So that would always be great if you could do that as well. And let me know if you do through Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean. Just DM me. And that's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I am your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.